sometimes due to the abnormality in the lungs due to the pulmonary edema, or we can say that thickening of the alveolar walls, then the distance will be increasing, so it will be affecting the transport of these gases. Then the fourth factor when we are talking about is the solubility of the gases. So when we talk about the solubility of the gases, carbon dioxide diffuses faster than oxygen because of the solubility, more soluble nature of the carbon dioxide. Now, internal respiration when we are talking about, at rest, about 1/4 of the oxygen in the oxygenated blood diffuses into the tissue or the cells. So, deoxygenated blood still contains considerable amount of oxygen. You should not have the expectation that during the internal respiration, all the oxygen which is present in the blood is transferred to the cells or the tissues, and that blood or the deoxygenated blood which is coming back for oxygenation in the lungs is completely devoid of oxygen. Now, when we talk about the strenuous exercises, more of this oxygen will be diffusing out depending on the higher metabolic rate in the active cells. Now, we come to the transport of gases. So, transport of gases when we are talking about, we have seen that it also depends on the solubility of these gases. Now, when we talk about oxygen, this oxygen does not dissolve readily in water. So, therefore, when we talk about the plasma portion of the blood, only 1.5% of oxygen is there in the plasma. The remaining 98.5% of oxygen is carried by the hemoglobin in the form of oxyhemoglobin inside the red blood cells. In areas where partial pressure of oxygen is high, that is especially when we are talking about the pulmonary capillaries, hemoglobin binds with amounts of oxygen and is said to be fully saturated. So you might have come across the oxygen hemoglobin saturation curves. So that saturation when we are talking about, it is the maximum amount of oxygen which can dissolve or which can attach with the hemoglobin. Now, when we talk about the fully saturated hemoglobin curves, you cannot expect 100% because we have already seen that only 98.5% of oxygen is associated with hemoglobin. So this saturated hemoglobin leaves the lungs and travels to the tissues where the partial pressure of oxygen is lower. So the reaction reverses in the sense the oxygen is transported from the blood to the cells or tissues. The partial pressure of oxygen in the tissues is always lower than what was there in the lungs. Therefore, the more amount of oxygen is always released into the cells. Now, when we talk about the transport of oxygen, some other factors like the acidity or the pH is also dependent on that. In an acidic pH, the affinity of hemoglobin for oxygen is low. So, in a situation, that is why when the lactic acid production or when it comes to some of the tissues, the acid level is more or the hydrogen ion concentration is more, then in that case hemoglobin will have a tendency to join with the protons and release the oxygen. That is what we call it as the Bohr effect. Now, second factor which depends on this transport of oxygen is the temperature of the tissues. If the temperature is more, then more oxygen will be released from the hemoglobin. So that is why the highly active cells or the metabolically active cells produce more heat, and that is why more oxygen will be released in that region and more oxygen will be available for that cells. Third aspect when we are talking about is the transport of or the partial pressure of carbon dioxide. Now, partial pressure of carbon dioxide, when we are talking about this, carbon dioxide can also combine with hemoglobin for the formation of carboxyhemoglobin, and it combines with the hemoglobin. That does not mean that it will be releasing oxygen. More carbon dioxide is present, the more oxygen is released by the hemoglobin. Another effect of increased carbon dioxide levels is due to the fact that the carbon dioxide in the blood undergoes another reaction with the help of carbonic anhydrase enzyme. The carbon dioxide combines with the water to carbonic acid, and this is again converted to the protons and the bicarbonates, and these bicarbonates again can form into carbon dioxide. So the available carbon dioxide, if more bicarbonates are produced, then the available carbon dioxide will be less. Another factor which depends on the transport of oxygen is because when we have talked about the transport of oxygen, it is done by the red blood cells. Now, you know that these red blood cells which are there, they do not have any of the cell organelles, especially the mitochondria, which will be the energy powerhouse of the cells or the tissues. Now, instead of or in the absence of mitochondria, the energy is obtained by the red blood cells with the help of diffuseglycerates, or also it is known as 2,3-biphosphoglycerates, and this will be producing, or the process combines with the hemoglobin and encourage the release of oxygen, or the more aerobic respiratory process will be going on with the help of DPGs. Now, compared to the adult hemoglobin, when we talk about the fetal hemoglobin, the fetal hemoglobin has got a capacity to carry 30% more oxygen than the adult or the maternal hemoglobin. So that is why the placenta oxygen is readily transferred to the fetal blood. So the hypoxic condition of the fetus never occurs. Now we come to the carbon dioxide transport. Carbon dioxide is carried in 3 different forms. Oxygen, we have seen that either it is there in the plasma or it will be done by the transport of hemoglobin, whereas carbon dioxide, when we are talking about, either it will be dissolved in plasma, approximately 7%, because the solubility of carbon dioxide in water is higher than oxygen. Second process by which carbon dioxide is transported, approximately 23% of carbon dioxide only is transported combining with hemoglobin. That is what we call it as the carbaminohemoglobins, and the majority of the carbon dioxide is transported in the body with the help of bicarbonate ions, which we have already seen the equation. Carbon dioxide having a reaction with water forming carbonic acid, and this carbonic acid will be producing the bicarbonates and the protons with the help of carbonic anhydrase enzyme. As bicarbonate ions accumulate inside the RBCs, some of them diffuse out into the plasma because of the concentration gradient. These negatively charged ions, to maintain the membrane potential, is balanced by the transport of chlorides. So these negatively chloride ions, when the bicarbonates comes out, enters into the cell for creating an ionic balance, and this process is known as the chloride shift. The deoxygenated blood which is entering the lungs contains the following substances related to carbon dioxide. Carbon dioxide dissolved in plasma, carbaminohemoglobin, bicarbonates, and proton ions and proton combined with hemoglobin. In pulmonary capillaries, the dissolved carbon dioxide diffuses into the alveoli and this is expired out. So carbaminohemoglobin splits and releases the carbon dioxide. The bicarbonates and the protons which undergo the following reaction, as we have seen, the reverse reaction what we have seen earlier, that is, the protons will combine with the bicarbonates forming the carbonic acid, and which will be converted to carbon dioxide and water, and which will be happening mainly inside the RBCs. Now, an increase in the carbon dioxide in the blood causes oxygen to split from the hemoglobin, and the binding of oxygen to hemoglobin will help in the release of carbon dioxide from the blood to the exterior. So this process we usually call it as the Haldane effect. The carbonic acid reaction, as we have mentioned earlier, can occur in two ways. One in the cells or the tissues, and one in the lungs. So if the bicarbonates can be if the carbonic acid can be converted to the protons and the bicarbonates in the tissues, and these bicarbonates will be taken up in the form of carbon dioxide, or this carbonic acid which is there, which is coming, will be converted to carbon dioxide and water in the lungs, and this carbon dioxide will be exhaled out into the atmosphere. Now comes the question, how much of oxygen can be bound with hemoglobin? As we know, or earlier as we have mentioned, the maximum saturation of oxygen with hemoglobin is approximately 98.5%. Now, the amount of oxygen attaches to 1 gram of hemoglobin is approximately 1.34 ml. And for a normal person, the amount of hemoglobin present is 15 gram percentage, or we usually call it as 15 grams per deciliter or 100 ml of blood. Now, the oxygen transported as hemoglobin bound or in the form of oxyhemoglobin, we generally call it as the hemoglobin carrying capacity, depends on the amount of oxygen which can attach with 1 gram multiplied by the total amount of hemoglobin present in the blood. So, for a normal person, the amount of oxygen which can be bound to hemoglobin will be approximately 20 ml per deciliter of the arterial blood. Now comes to the hemoglobin saturation. So hemoglobin saturation, we usually call it as SbO2, that is the extent of oxygen or the combination of oxygen with hemoglobin. So that is what we usually call it as percent saturation of hemoglobin or SbO2. The fully saturated, when the 4 subunits bind to the oxygen from the hemoglobin, SbO2 is considered as the ratio of oxygen content in the blood and the hemoglobin carrying capacity multiplied by 100 to find out the percentage. At PO2 of 100 mmHg at pulmonary capillaries, the SbO2 is approximately 97.5, because we have already seen that the physiological shunt add some of the venous blood along with the arterial blood. So completely we cannot say, or earlier, in other words, what we have seen is the saturation of oxygen with hemoglobin will not cross around 98 or 98.5%. Now, this saturation of hemoglobin with saturation of oxygen with hemoglobin depends on other factors like for example, temperature. Now, lower the temperature when we are talking about, the saturation of hemoglobin and oxygen will be higher, or this graph we generally call it as the oxygen hemoglobin saturation curves. So the plot will be the middle portion, or the black color line which shows is the normal blood temperature, that is 37 degrees centigrade, and a lower temperature, the temperature is lower, the saturation will be higher, and if the temperature is high, the saturation will be lower. So up the curve is lower temperature and down the curve is the higher temperature. Another factor which is associated with the saturation of hemoglobin and oxygen is the amount of carbon dioxide or the partial pressure of carbon dioxide which is present. Now, low carbon dioxide or partial pressure of carbon dioxide is low, the saturation of oxygen with hemoglobin is high. So approximately here, if you see around more than 60% of oxygen can be saturated with hemoglobin at a partial pressure of 30 of oxygen. Whereas when we are talking about the high amount of carbon dioxide when we are talking about and the same amount of oxygen, the percentage of saturation is coming less than 40%. Third factor which depends on the saturation of oxygen with hemoglobin when we are talking about is the blood pH. Higher the blood pH or lower the amount of protons